Autistomatic videos are planned well in advance, and this series especially so. But now and again, plans get changed because of feedback from viewers. The last 2 films have been about autistic needs and approaches to honesty. Last week's video about our tendency to be candid or blunt generated a number of requests from both autistic and non-autistic people to talk about it more. There were 2 aspects that came up in particular. Autistic people wanted me to talk about why we feel such a strong need to demonstrate balance on uncertain or controversial topics, to look at the pros and cons of a subject and seek new information to bolster our understanding. From the non-autistic side, it was incomprehension, even frustration over our apparent blunt negativity, our tendency for long involved explanations, asking too many questions and overconfidence in our abilities. The odd thing is that these 2 topics are actually opposite sides of the same coin. It may not seem obvious at first, but this is actually related to another myth about autistic people, that we can't see the big picture. Today we'll be asking, how do blunt statements and awkward questions help form the autistic big picture? Why do these get us into trouble? And how can autistic and non-autistic people get on with each other better when we see such different views of the same world? Why do autistic people, like me, so often feel it so important to express our feelings on both sides of any topic? It's not one of those aspects of our personalities that gets highlighted by doctors and academics, but it's something we've observed about ourselves for years. If anything, the opposite is said of us, that we have rigid black and white viewpoints on the world. But whilst there is a grain of truth in there, it's far from the whole truth of autistic understanding and how we form opinions. If anyone is missing the big picture here, it's not us autists. If asked a question or put on the spot for an opinion, we frequently discuss the arguments on both sides rather than express a solid point of view. We don't do it about everything. Sometimes we'll offer opinions that are extremely certain and back them up with a battery of evidence, often more than those around us want to hear. That's what led to the assumptions about rigid thinking. But at other times, we may seem to onlookers to be sitting on the fence about topics they think we should feel strongly about. 2 common traits of autistic people are an eye for detail and a skill for seeing patterns. It's natural to us to examine everything thoroughly and consider influences not everyone would think of. How we structure these observations varies. I'm a visual thinker. In my case, I visualise the various influences on a situation as parts in a machine, but other autists see it in their own ways. We may interpret things as a flowchart, a blueprint, an artwork, a piece of music, or even a recipe. However our minds translate the multiple factors into a cogent framework, the heart of the process is the same. Our autistic minds rationalise our perceptions into a form that makes sense to us, and we work through the information accordingly. Much of the time, information slots neatly into place. In my case, if the facts and my observations translate into a set of gears, levers and pistons that make the notion move in my mind, then I can form an opinion. But all too often they don't. Sometimes they fail to form the Heath Robinson contraption of comprehension I need in my mental engine room, and just end up as a clashing, jamming mess of randomly assembled components. When that happens, I can't express a clear opinion. There's no input, process and output. There's just a bunch of components that don't fit together. Others may visualise shapes that don't fit, colours that don't blend, notes that clash, or flavours that leave a nasty taste on the palate. It creates dissonance in our brains that for some of us can be painful. It keeps us awake at night, trying to rearrange the mismatched parts to make them work together. When we're expected to talk about these information jams in casual conversation, or worse, under examination, it's impossible to come up with the easy answers people expect of us. All we can do is list the clashing factors we've considered and express the influences they have on our viewpoints. No conclusion can be drawn, so we cannot express an opinion to satisfy the people who want one from us. It's not uncommon for us to feel unduly pressured to come up with conclusions we've failed to find before. So we find ourselves attempting to construct our mental machines on the spot. That leads to frustration, which in turn may become self-loathing, internalised anger, and meltdowns. This sets us apart from most of the rest of the world. We live in societies which are built on artificially manipulated data. Rarely is information conveyed without an opinion or a bias attached to it. Long before the internet, television, radio, even the printing press, our informational feeds were tainted by other people's desire to shape the opinions of others. Arguably, as the technologies of information and entertainment have progressed, it's become easier for the individual to form a balanced view of any given topic. But that's not the way the average mind works. To most people, there's simply too much information to digest, so they must prioritise what they choose to absorb or be overwhelmed. Cognitive bias shapes the minds of most people. Whether it be a result of upbringing, peer pressure, or a mixture of both, the average human mind tends to stick to a set of opinions and tastes that are rigidly in place by the time we hit adulthood. An 18-year-old conservative or liberal will likely remain conservative or liberal all their lives. Most people stick to the same religious beliefs they were brought up with, express loyalty and patriotism to the country they were born in, and fear outside influence upsetting that balance. The ever-increasing availability of information has challenged these ideals for much of the population, leading many non-autistic people to question their beliefs, yet the majority stick to their habitual points of view. In the autistic mind, our beliefs have been formed through a process of introspection, of soul-searching, and of balancing opposing interpretations of the same information. Our viewpoints are usually our own, and when we can't make the various influences and facts add up, we can't express an opinion. Of course, we are as vulnerable as anyone else to misunderstandings if information is not available, is hidden, or heavily manipulated. But once we become aware, each snippet of knowledge becomes a cog in the mind machine. That frustrates our non-autistic partners, friends and family members no end. Why can't we just tie ourselves down to a specific idea like everyone else does? Why must we insist on working things out for ourselves when the answers are obvious? If everybody around us thinks the same, why do we feel we have to be different? Are we just argumentative by nature? Don't we understand that going against the flow upsets people? But that's the problem, isn't it? Going against the flow shouldn't upset people, but it does. Society has become so reliant on consensus of opinion, even when that opinion is harmful to us, that people who think for themselves and challenge those points of view are excluded. Societal attitudes that make no sense whatsoever and cause harm to countless people get accepted by the majority rather than rocking the boat. People who challenge the damaging status quo are punished by the majority who ride the currents. They're labelled as agitators, dissidents, or troublemakers. When an autist sees a system that doesn't make sense and expresses their need to balance opposing points of view or understand which of the conflicting information they're presented with is actually true, we are all too often seen as attempting to cause trouble. We're told we're rude, aggressive, or contrarian because we don't simply accept the notions most people do. We have to understand the reasons behind those notions. Now, let's talk about how this fits into the big picture. Autists are frequently dismissed for our supposed inability to see this big picture. But what is it we're meant to be missing? Most of the time, the big picture is actually a result of the same cognitive bias that keeps people riding the currents of the socially accepted narrative, rather than making their own minds up. It's a shortcut in the same way that conventional theory of mind is. People don't have to think about everything or determine their own value judgments if it's already mapped out for them by their upbringing, their faith, their education, and the media we're surrounded by. Nobody has to waste time worrying about why things are the way they are, because the big picture is all they need to know. All it takes is a couple of carefully picked facts to support the big picture view, and it's accepted by the majority as the way things should be. When my autistic brain interprets the information around me, I can't ignore the dissonance. I can't go with the flow if I see details that contradict the party line and prevent me from making sense of it. If the big picture is built on falsehood or lacks information that explains it, it doesn't sit right, and I have to question it. It's not that I can't see the big picture, it's that the big picture is an illusion designed to keep societies ticking over. It allows people to concentrate on living their lives rather than fighting battles they don't feel they need to. Most people aren't ignorant of the facts that autists find so difficult to reconcile, but they feel powerless to make the changes to society that would be needed. People feel overwhelmed by the big picture. They do their bit, they make the effort, they simply don't have the power to change everything for the better. It's not worth sticking their necks out to challenge the small injustices, because there will always be larger injustices they have no influence over. When autistic people ask questions that highlight flaws in the big picture, we make people uncomfortable. They live in a society that works. It's not perfect, but it functions. They've accepted their place in the hierarchy and do their part. When we start pointing out the huge failures of the system and the changes that need to be made, it's naturally going to make people defensive. When we cast doubt on the status quo they've chosen to accept, it can't help but feel like personal criticism. We're seen as negative, uncooperative, or even nasty. Nowhere is this more evident than when we talk about ourselves. There's nothing in this world that an autist is more uncertain of than how we personally fit into the world. Part of this is due to social exclusion and the many harmful myths that surround us. But it's also down to our need to slot the details together to make a coherent picture. When we are asked to talk about ourselves, we will almost always offer a dual viewpoint. We will talk about our weaknesses and our failings, our insecurities and our doubts. But we will also talk about our passions and our strengths with confidence. Depending on the circumstances, this earns us a label of either being depressive and negative about ourselves or arrogant and egotistical. It can even be down to which order we choose to say things. We rarely get the opportunity to finish our self-analysis when asked, because people tend to react to what we say first. If we start on a weakness, we're seen as defeatist. But if we start on a strength, we're big-headed and self-important. Whilst we can be aware of this in ourselves, it is unbelievably difficult for autistic people to modulate our honesty away from this aspect of our natures. We cannot help but have questions when things don't make sense. Many of us have compensated by simply going quiet or avoiding contact with other people. If it gets too much, we may even give up on some forms of communication altogether, temporarily or permanently. If we say nothing or avoid being around people, we can't get into trouble for stating the truth or asking questions. Most of us want to understand why people think the way they do. But when we ask them why, they often can't give us sufficient answers to fit into all the gaps in our mental machines. The more we push them for answers, the more defensive they get, and the more aggressive they believe us to be. When you're close to an autistic person, you may sometimes find yourself in the position of feeling like you're being interrogated. It's not because they are insensitive or attempting to undermine you. They're simply trying to understand you or something about the world which you accept but makes no sense to them. We've already talked of the bad way to handle it by labelling and criticising. But what's the good way? How can non-autistic people respect the needs of their autistic partners, friends, relatives and colleagues, whilst not losing sight of the tools they need to function in an unbalanced and unfair world? The first step is to not jump to conclusions. Recognise that you're not under attack. You're simply being asked to provide a part for the autistic mental machine. The information we are asking of you or inviting comment or confirmation on is a cog in our mental machine, a colour in our mind painting, or an ingredient in our sore spot of thoughts. The second is to realise that you don't have to answer immediately. You can tell us that now is not a good time for this discussion and ask us to talk about it later. You might be tired, in a hurry, or just in a bad mood. You might need time to think about what we've just bluntly unloaded upon you. It doesn't matter which. It just matters that whatever reason you give us, it's the truth. It's not making excuses if it's the truth. It's simply asking us to defer the discussion until a better time. Our curiosity will not go away, but it can wait until you're in a better position to indulge it. The third and final thing is to be fine with saying, "I don't know." It's a phrase that people often don't like saying, especially if they feel they should know. But there's no shame in simply not knowing. Sometimes we will assail you with information which challenges things you've taken for granted all your life, or ask you questions you've never even thought of. Simply saying that you can't answer because you don't know, or need more time to think, is the only honest thing you can do. And as we've already discussed in previous videos in the series, honesty is incredibly important to most autistic people. If you don't know, there's no point in us asking you, so we will look elsewhere. As autistic people, we have to be willing to accept it when those we're close to don't feel like talking right now, or when they tell us they don't have the answers we seek. If we push for answers they don't have, or insist on continuing a conversation they're not best placed for, we unintentionally become bullies. We're not trying to cause emotional pain or doubt, but by not respecting their boundaries, we do so nonetheless. We may think we're having an interesting, enlightening conversation, but we're actually intimidating people we care about. Autistic people are often just as aware of the big picture as everyone else, but we see it as a sum of its parts. If some of those parts are missing or are the wrong shape, we have to question it. When we do ask those questions or express our doubts, we sometimes upset people. Non-autistic people have often accepted that to fit into an unfair world, they sometimes have to tolerate things that don't make sense or are unjust because they don't feel they have the power to change them. They prioritise their energies and efforts towards things they feel they do have influence on. Autistic and non-autistic people will never see the big picture in the same way. But we can learn to respect the different methods we use to make sense of the world, and trust that the people we care about want us to be happy. Aren't those the very foundations of good relationships? Respect and trust? Thank you for watching. If you click on the channel logo here on the left, you can subscribe to this channel for weekly videos on autistic life. And over here on the top right is another film from this series on autism and relationships, or visit autismatic.com.